The morning of my 64th birthday, I stood at the kitchen sink, washing a single coffee mug, and I thought, this is the quietest my house has ever been. Not peaceful quiet. The other kind. My daughter had called 2 nights before. Not to ask how I was feeling, not to say she was thinking of me. She called to confirm that I was still handling the reservation. The one at Harborview, she said, like I might have forgotten. Saturday, 7 o'clock, 14 people. I asked her to repeat that number. 14, Mom. Marcus and I, the kids, his parents, Aunt Faye. She paused to count under her breath. 14. You said you'd take care of it. I had not said that. What I had said 3 weeks earlier when she first mentioned a birthday dinner was that I thought it sounded lovely. That was all. I had said it sounded lovely. The way you say a painting looks nice when someone shows it to you on their phone. It was a pleasantry. It was not a contract. But I had learned, over many years of being this particular woman's mother, that pleasantries had a way of becoming contracts when it suited her. Harborview, I said. It's nice, Mom. You'll like it. I had been to Harborview once, for a colleague's retirement dinner, back when I was still teaching. The prix was $220 a head. I remembered because my colleague had warned us ahead of time, apologetically, and I had quietly rearranged a few things in my budget that month so I could go without making her feel bad. 14 people. I did the math in my head, and then I set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment, looking at the backyard, at the dogwood tree my husband Wallace had planted the spring before he died. It had finally started to bloom the way he always said it would. He had been so patient with that tree. I picked the phone back up. I'll let you know, I said. She took that as a yes. I should tell you something about my daughter, because I don't want you to think she was always this way. She wasn't. There was a version of her I remember clearly. A girl who used to wait for me at the end of the driveway when I came home from school in the afternoons, not because I asked her to, but because she wanted to carry my bag. She was 7, maybe 8. The bag was almost as big as she was. That girl became someone else gradually, the way erosion works. You don't notice each individual loss. You just look up one day and the riverbank has moved. I think part of it was Marcus. Not that I blame him entirely. She had been heading in a certain direction before he came along. But he had money, and he had opinions about what people like him did and didn't do. And somewhere in the first years of their marriage, she began to absorb those opinions like they were her own. People like them did not drive used cars. People like them did not vacation anywhere you could reach by highway. And people like them, apparently, did not pay for their own birthday celebrations when there was a mother available to do it. My son-in-law had never worked a job that required him to stand on his feet for 8 hours. I had done it for 31 years. I taught high school English in the same district where I had grown up, where my mother had taken me to register for kindergarten, holding my hand in both of hers. I knew the custodians by name. I stayed late on Tuesdays to help kids who were struggling. I drove 45 minutes each way. I loved it. I want to be clear about that. I never resented the work itself. What I resented, what I had been quietly resenting for longer than I could easily name, was the way my daughter had started to look at that work. As if it were something small. As if the fact that I had done it with care and consistency for 3 decades somehow made it less impressive than whatever it was Marcus did in his glass office downtown. Wallace saw it happening. He mentioned it to me once, carefully, the way he said difficult things. We were sitting on the back porch, and he said, I worry that she doesn't understand what things cost. He meant money. He also meant something else. He died 4 years ago, a Wednesday in November, and the grief of it was so large that I didn't have room for anything else for a very long time. My daughter came to the funeral and cried genuinely and held my hand. In those weeks, I thought maybe I had been wrong about the direction she was heading. Maybe loss would recalibrate something. It did, for a while. And then it didn't. The reservation at Harborview had been made in my name. I found this out when I called to confirm it, 2 days after my daughter and I spoke. The hostess was pleasant. She said they were looking forward to welcoming our party. She mentioned the deposit. I'm sorry, I said. The deposit? Yes, for parties over 10. $200 charged to the card on file. There was no card on file. They had made the reservation using my name but had not provided payment information, presumably because they expected me to handle that when I arrived. Which I suppose was the plan all along. I thanked the hostess and told her I'd call back. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Wallace and I had done our taxes every February, where I'd helped my daughter with college applications, where I'd eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners and thought nothing of them, because ordinary dinners are not the kind of thing you think about until they're gone. I thought about what he would have said. He would have said, in that quiet way of his, that the situation had become clear and that clarity was useful. He believed in clarity. He believed in not borrowing trouble, but also in not pretending that trouble hadn't arrived when it plainly had. The situation was this. My daughter had booked a dinner for 14 people at a restaurant I could not afford, without meaningfully disrupting my monthly budget, had listed me as the responsible party without asking, and had not mentioned the word payment once in our conversation. She had assumed. She had assumed in the way people assume when they have spent enough years having things assumed for them. I was 64 years old. I had a pension, a modest savings account, and a house that was paid off. I was not poor. But I was also not someone for whom $220 a head, times 14, plus wine, plus tax, plus the kind of tip you leave at a place like Harborview, was simply an evening out. I was someone who still checked the weekly grocery circular. I was someone who had driven the same car for 11 years because it ran fine, and I saw no reason to replace something that still worked. I was someone who had never once in my life called a plumber for something I could fix with a YouTube video and 40 minutes of patience. I had not built a comfortable life by spending money other people assumed I had. Here is what I did not do. I did not call my daughter and say any of this. Not because I was afraid, but because I had tried versions of that conversation before, and what I had learned was that it did not land. It became a discussion about my attitude, or my inability to enjoy things, or, and this was the one that stung, my complicated relationship with money. A phrase Marcus had used once at Thanksgiving that my daughter had not corrected. I had grown up the daughter of a woman who worked the counter at a dry cleaner's 6 days a week and still managed to put 2 kids through state school. My relationship with money was not complicated. It was deeply, gratefully simple. You earn it honestly, you spend it carefully, and you do not take it from people who cannot afford to give it. So instead of calling, I thought, and while I was thinking, I remembered something. 3 years before Wallace died, before things had shifted in the way they shifted, my daughter had gone through a difficult period. Her marriage was rocky in the way new marriages sometimes are. Not unfixable, but strained. She had called me on a Thursday night, crying in that helpless way she hadn't cried since she was small, and she had said she didn't know what to do, and I had driven 40 minutes to sit with her on her couch until nearly 2 in the morning. We didn't talk about much. I made her tea. I held her hand. At one point, she put her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was a child, and I thought, she is still in there. The girl at the end of the driveway. She is still in there somewhere under all of it. I had never told her what I gave up to be there that night. That I had a stack of junior papers due back to students the next morning that I hadn't finished grading. That I graded them in the car in her driveway before I drove home at 2:15 because I wasn't going to let those kids down. That I taught that Friday on 3 hours of sleep without telling a single person. I had not done that for credit. I had done it because she needed me, and I was her mother, and that was simply what you did. But somewhere in the years that followed, the things I did quietly had become invisible, and the things I did quietly had also become expected. And expected things, once they are expected long enough, stop being kindnesses and start being obligations, and then they stop even being noticed at all. I am not a dramatic person. I want to be clear about that too. I do not enjoy scenes. I do not enjoy conflict. For most of my adult life, I have preferred to absorb discomfort privately and deal with it in my own time, which I am aware is not always the healthiest approach, but which has also spared me a great deal of unnecessary noise. But there is a difference between choosing peace and disappearing into it. Wallace used to say that the kindest thing you could do for someone who was walking in the wrong direction was to stop walking with them. Not to argue with them about the direction. Just to stop, quietly, and let them go on ahead. I thought about that a lot in the days after the phone call about Harborview, and then I made a plan. I had been invited, 8 months earlier, to the 50th anniversary reunion of my college graduating class, held over a long weekend at the university. I had RSVP'd yes, then changed it to no when my daughter mentioned she was thinking of visiting that same weekend. Then she hadn't come. Then I had forgotten to change it back. The reunion was the same weekend as my birthday dinner. I called the alumni office on a Wednesday morning. A young woman named, I believe, something cheerful answered and told me that yes, there was still space, and that she was so glad I had called, and that it was going to be a wonderful weekend. I told her I was sure it was. I booked a room at the inn on the edge of campus where Wallace and I had stayed when we visited years ago, the one with the window seat in the corner room where you could see the chapel. I booked it for 3 nights. I used points I had been accumulating for 2 years on a credit card I kept for exactly this kind of purpose. The room cost me nothing. I called the airline. There was a flight that left Saturday morning at 9:15. I would miss the dinner entirely. I would be in the air, or checking in, or walking across the campus where I had been 20 years old and had not yet become anyone's mother or anyone's assumption. Before I left, I wrote a letter. I have always been a person who writes letters. Not emails, letters on paper, the kind you have to think about before you write because you cannot simply delete them. I wrote one to Wallace when we were dating, before things were certain between us, and he kept it in his desk drawer until the day he died. I found it when I was going through his things and had to sit down on the floor of his office for a long time. I wrote this letter at the kitchen table on a Friday evening. I wrote it by hand in the fountain pen my students had given me when I retired, the one with my initials on the barrel. I wrote 3 drafts. I sealed the final one in an envelope and addressed it to my daughter. And I placed it on the kitchen counter where she would see it if she came by, which she sometimes did when she expected something from me. I did not write it in anger. I wrote it in the voice of someone who had decided that the most honest thing she could do, after 64 years of softening things for other people's comfort, was to say what was true. I told her that I loved her. I told her that I had loved her since before she existed, in the way you love something you have been waiting for, without knowing it. I told her that I had paid for things over the years, not because I was obligated, but because I wanted to. And that there was a difference between wanting to and being assumed to, and that the difference mattered, and that I had not found a way to explain this to her in person that she was able to hear. I told her that I had done the math on Harborview and that I was not going to attend. I told her where I would be instead. And then I wrote the part I had been sitting with the longest. I told her that I knew more about her life than she thought I did. Not because I had been watching or gathering evidence, but because mothers know. We know the way you know. The weather is changing before it changes. Something in the air shifts, and you feel it in your chest before you can name it. I knew that her marriage had gotten easier in recent years, and that she was happier than she'd been at 30. I knew that my grandson, who was 11 and who called me every Sunday without being asked, was going to be exactly fine. I knew that underneath whatever she had become in the years since Marcus's world absorbed her, the girl who had carried my school bag was still there. But I also knew that she would never see me clearly until I stopped making it easy not to. I sealed the envelope. I put it on the counter. I went upstairs and packed my bag. I did not sleep well that Friday night. I want to be honest about that. I lay in the dark for a long time listening to the house settle, which old houses do. And I thought about all the things you think about when you are 64. And your husband is gone and your daughter does not quite see you. I thought about who I had been before I was anyone's wife or mother. I thought about the girl I was at this university I was going back to. The one who had argued about Flannery O'Connor in a seminar room until the professor asked everyone else to leave so she could argue back properly. I thought about the first time I stood in front of a classroom and felt completely terrified and completely right. I thought about Wallace planting the dogwood tree. I thought about what it meant that it was blooming now, after all this time. At some point, I fell asleep. My alarm went off at 6. I dressed quietly, as if someone might hear me, though there was no one to hear. I carried my bag downstairs. I looked at the letter on the counter. I looked at the dogwood through the kitchen window, catching the early light. I locked the front door behind me and drove to the airport. The flight was smooth. I had a window seat, which I had requested specifically. I watched the city fall away beneath me, and then the suburbs, and then the long stretch of farmland that I had always loved from above, the orderly squares of it, the patience of it. I thought about the 14 people sitting down to dinner that evening at Harborview. I thought about the moment when someone, probably my son-in-law, probably with that particular expression of controlled irritation he used when things weren't going as planned, would ask the hostess to confirm the billing arrangement. I thought about the silence that would follow. I did not think it with satisfaction, exactly. It was more complicated than satisfaction. It was the feeling of having told the truth after a long time of not telling it, which is its own kind of ache, even when it is also a relief. My seatmate was a retired schoolteacher from outside of Cleveland. We figured that out within the first 10 minutes and then talked for an hour straight about everything. The profession, the kids we remembered, the ones who had come back years later to tell us things we hadn't known we'd given them. She had taught 4th grade for 28 years. She had the same kind of hands as my mother. By the time we landed, I felt like myself again, or maybe more like myself than I had in quite a while. The campus was smaller than I remembered, and more beautiful. That is the thing about places you loved when you were young. The memory of them is big and generalized. And then you return and find that the beauty was in the specific details you had forgotten. The particular color of the limestone in afternoon light. The way the path curved just before the library. The smell of the dining hall that was somehow exactly the same. I checked into my room at the inn and stood at the window seat and looked at the chapel. My phone had 11 missed calls. I turned it face down on the nightstand. I washed my face. I went downstairs and walked across the campus to the welcome reception, where I found people I had not seen in 50 years who remembered things about me I had half forgotten, and who were delighted to see me in the way that only people who knew you before everything happened can be delighted to see you. I stayed until late. I laughed more than I had in months. I called my daughter on Sunday morning. I had read her texts by then. There were many of them, moving through several distinct emotional phases, and I had read them carefully and let them settle before I responded to any of them. She answered on the first ring. There was a silence, and then she said, "Mom." I said, "Hello, sweetheart." Another silence, and then she said quietly, "I didn't know you'd actually go." I told her that I knew she hadn't. She was quiet for a moment. I waited. The dinner was. She started, and then stopped. "It was a lot, without you there." Marcus had to. She stopped again. I did not say anything. I had learned, over 31 years of teaching teenagers, that silence is one of the most useful tools available to a person. That people will often say the true thing if you simply wait, she said. "I think I've been making some assumptions," I said. "I think you have." Another silence. "I didn't read the letter until this morning," she said. "I read it twice." I asked her what she thought. She was quiet long enough that I looked out the window at the chapel. Then she said, "I think I forgot that you're a whole person." It was the most honest thing she had said to me in years. Maybe ever. I told her that I loved her. I told her that I was going to walk across the campus and have breakfast with some people I hadn't seen since we were young, and that I would call her when I was home. She said, "Okay." She said, "I'm glad you went." I told her I was too. I flew home on Monday. The dogwood tree was still in bloom. I made coffee, black, no sugar, and stood at the kitchen sink, holding the mug with both hands, the way my mother used to hold hers. And I looked at the tree, and I thought about Wallace. I thought about how he had planted it in a year when neither of us knew yet how many years we had. He had planted it as if there was all the time in the world. as if patience was not a sacrifice, but simply the natural posture of someone who trusted that things would become what they were meant to become. The tree had taken its time, but it had bloomed,